The origins of Nazi propaganda are deeply connected to the political, economic, and psychological crisis that gripped Germany after the end of the First World War. Germany's defeat in 1918 and the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles left the nation humiliated and unstable. Massive war reparations, territorial losses, military restrictions, and the war guilt clause damaged Germany's economy and national pride. Inflation destroyed savings, unemployment rose sharply, and democratic institutions struggled to maintain public trust. In this atmosphere of fear, anger, and uncertainty, extremist movements found fertile ground. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party, rose to prominence by promising national revival, unity, and revenge against those they blamed for Germany's suffering. However, ideology alone was not enough to capture the loyalty of millions. It was propaganda that transformed Nazi ideas into a powerful mass movement. Propaganda had already played a role during the First World War, but the Nazis elevated it to an unprecedented level. Adolf Hitler believed deeply in the power of propaganda, an idea he expressed in his book Mein Kampf. He argued that propaganda should not appeal to reason but to emotion, and that it should be simple, repetitive, and directed toward the broad masses rather than intellectual elites. According to Hitler, the success of any political movement depended on its ability to control how people thought, felt, and perceived reality. These ideas became the foundation of the Nazi propaganda system once the party came to power. The central figure behind the organization and execution of Nazi propaganda was Joseph Goebbels. In 1933, shortly after Hitler became Chancellor, Goebbels was appointed Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Despite his unimpressive physical appearance, Goebbels possessed a sharp intellect, deep understanding of mass psychology, and complete devotion to Hitler. He viewed propaganda as a scientific and artistic process, one that required careful planning, emotional manipulation, and total control of communication. For Goebbels, propaganda was not about truth, it was about effectiveness. He famously believed that a lie repeated often enough would eventually be accepted as truth. Once in power, the Nazis moved quickly to eliminate freedom of expression in Germany. Independent newspapers were shut down or forced into Nazi ownership, journalists were required to join state-controlled organizations, and any criticism of the regime was treated as treason. Books that contradicted Nazi ideology were burned in public ceremonies, sending a powerful message about intellectual conformity. Radio stations, publishing houses, theaters, and cultural institutions were placed under strict supervision. Through these measures, the Nazi state ensured that alternative viewpoints were silenced and that citizens were exposed to a single, carefully constructed version of reality. At the center of this controlled reality stood Adolf Hitler, whose image was meticulously crafted through propaganda. Hitler was portrayed not as an ordinary politician but as a heroic and almost mystical figure destined to lead Germany to greatness. Posters, photographs, films, and news reports showed him as strong, calm, and visionary, often surrounded by enthusiastic crowds. His speeches were presented as moments of national importance, and his personal life was idealized to make him appear selfless and devoted entirely to the German people. Mistakes and failures were concealed, while achievements were exaggerated. Over time, this relentless messaging created a cult of personality that encouraged emotional loyalty rather than rational evaluation. Equally important to Nazi propaganda was the identification of enemies. The regime understood that unity could be strengthened by directing public anger toward specific groups. Jews were the primary targets of this strategy. Nazi propaganda portrayed Jews as dangerous outsiders responsible for Germany's defeat, economic problems, and moral decline. They were depicted as greedy, dishonest, and conspiratorial, often compared to parasites or criminals. Communists, liberals, and other minorities were also labeled as enemies of the nation. By simplifying complex social and economic issues and blaming them on identifiable groups, the Nazis redirected frustration away from the government and toward vulnerable populations. Goebbels and the Nazi leadership also recognized the power of mass experience in shaping beliefs. Large-scale rallies, parades, and ceremonies were carefully staged to create emotional impact. Events such as the Nuremberg rallies combined dramatic architecture, powerful symbols, music, uniforms, and synchronized movements to overwhelm individual thought. Participants felt part of something larger than themselves, strengthening their emotional attachment to the regime. These spectacles were widely publicized through films and photographs, extending their influence far beyond those who attended in person. Education and youth culture were also brought under the influence of propaganda. Schools were transformed into institutions of ideological training, where textbooks were rewritten to reflect Nazi racial theories and nationalist interpretations of history. Teachers were expected to demonstrate loyalty to the regime, and children were encouraged to report dissenting views, even within their own families. Youth organizations such as the Hitler Youth played a crucial role in shaping the beliefs of the younger generation, teaching obedience, militarism, and devotion to Hitler. Through these methods, propaganda ensured that Nazi ideology would continue to influence German society in the long term. By the late 1930s, propaganda had become an inseparable part of everyday life in Germany. It appeared in newspapers, classrooms, radios, cinemas, workplaces, and public spaces. Many Germans did not necessarily believe every message they encountered, but the absence of alternative information made resistance difficult. Over time, repeated exposure normalized extreme ideas and reduced moral resistance to discrimination and violence. Propaganda did not simply reflect Nazi power, it actively created and sustained it. As Germany moved toward war, propaganda prepared the population mentally for conflict. Military expansion was portrayed as defensive and necessary, while foreign nations were depicted as threats to German survival. The combination of fear, pride, and manipulated patriotism created a society ready to support aggression. By 1939, Nazi propaganda had successfully reshaped German political culture, silenced opposition, and mobilized the population behind Hitler's ambitions. The rise of Nazi propaganda under Joseph Goebbels stands as one of the most striking examples of how media control and psychological manipulation can transform a nation and lead it toward catastrophic consequences. As the Nazi regime consolidated its grip on Germany, propaganda evolved from a political instrument into a permanent feature of daily life. Unlike earlier movements that relied on occasional speeches or printed manifestos, the Nazis embedded their messaging into the routine experiences of ordinary citizens. From the moment people woke up to the time they went to sleep, carefully constructed narratives surrounded them, shaping how they understood the world. This constant exposure ensured that Nazi ideas were not merely heard but absorbed, often unconsciously, as part of normal social reality. One of the defining characteristics of Nazi propaganda was its ability to blend ideology with familiarity. Rather than presenting messages as formal political instruction, the regime infused them into entertainment, leisure, and cultural expression. Music, theater, sports events, and festivals were redesigned to reflect nationalist themes and loyalty to the state. Even seemingly harmless activities carried symbolic meaning, reinforcing the idea that personal identity was inseparable from national duty. By transforming ideology into culture, the regime reduced the distance between belief and behavior. Visual communication played a particularly significant role in this process. Nazi imagery relied on clarity, scale, and emotional impact rather than complexity. Bold colors, idealized human figures, and striking contrasts were used to create powerful impressions that required little explanation. These visuals were placed in public spaces where they could not be ignored: streets, workplaces, transportation hubs, and government buildings. Over time, these images became part of the visual environment, subtly shaping attitudes without the need for direct persuasion. Sound was another crucial element. Public announcements, patriotic songs, and coordinated chants created an atmosphere of unity and discipline. Carefully staged speeches were designed not only to inform but to provoke emotional reactions. Tone, rhythm, and repetition were used to generate excitement or fear, depending on the message. The spoken word became a tool of emotional synchronization, aligning individual feelings with collective goals. Cinema emerged as one of the most effective platforms for shaping perception. Films produced during the Nazi era rarely appeared overtly political on the surface. Instead, they told stories that reinforced loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice through characters and narratives that reflected regime values. Viewers were encouraged to identify with heroic figures who embodied strength and discipline, while negative characters often represented disorder or moral weakness. Through storytelling, propaganda reached audiences in a subtle yet deeply influential way. The regime also paid close attention to timing and context. Messages were carefully adapted to suit specific moments and circumstances. During periods of success, propaganda emphasized confidence and destiny. During moments of uncertainty, it focused on endurance and unity. This flexibility allowed the narrative to remain persuasive even as conditions changed. Rather than admitting error, propaganda reframed events in ways that preserved the regime's authority and credibility. Control over information was essential to maintaining the system. Alternative viewpoints were not debated but removed entirely from public space. Foreign perspectives were portrayed as hostile or deceptive, discouraging people from seeking outside information. Silence became as powerful as speech, as the absence of contradictory voices created the illusion of consensus. Many citizens came to believe that everyone around them shared the same views, reinforcing conformity through social pressure. Propaganda also targeted emotions tied to belonging and identity. Pride in national heritage was emphasized through selective interpretations of history, art, and tradition. The past was presented as a continuous story of struggle and greatness, with the present regime positioned as its rightful culmination. This narrative gave people a sense of purpose and continuity, making loyalty feel natural rather than forced. At the same time, fear was carefully cultivated. Warnings about internal and external threats created a sense of constant danger. Citizens were encouraged to remain vigilant, suspicious, and obedient. This atmosphere discouraged questioning and promoted self-censorship. People learned that safety depended on alignment with official narratives, while deviation carried social and legal risks. Perhaps the most effective aspect of Nazi propaganda was its ability to function without constant enforcement. Once internalized, beliefs began to regulate behavior from within. Individuals adjusted their actions, speech, and even thoughts to match expectations, often without direct coercion. Propaganda thus reduced the need for visible repression by transforming control into a psychological process. Children and young adults were especially vulnerable to this environment. Growing up surrounded by uniform messages, many lacked the tools to critically evaluate what they encountered. Loyalty was taught as a moral virtue, and obedience as a form of strength. Over time, these values became deeply embedded, shaping attitudes that extended into adulthood. By the late 1930s, propaganda had achieved its most significant goal: it had normalized an extraordinary political system. What would have once seemed extreme gradually appeared ordinary. Ideas of exclusion, hierarchy, and aggression were no longer shocking but familiar. This normalization prepared society to accept policies and actions that would otherwise have faced resistance. In this way, Nazi propaganda did not merely communicate ideas, it constructed a social reality in which those ideas felt inevitable. Through constant presence, emotional engagement, and strategic silence, it reshaped perception itself. The population did not simply receive propaganda, it lived inside it. This transformation of everyday life into a vehicle for ideology marked one of the most sophisticated and dangerous uses of propaganda in modern history. When war finally erupted in Europe, propaganda entered a more intense and demanding phase. The shift from ideological preparation to total war required a new kind of messaging, one that could sustain belief under pressure and obedience under suffering. The German population was no longer being persuaded merely to support a political movement, it was now being asked to endure loss, fear, and sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. In this context, propaganda became the emotional backbone of the war effort, tasked with maintaining morale even as reality grew increasingly harsh. At the beginning of the conflict, the tone of official messaging was confident and assured. Military actions were presented as swift, precise, and overwhelmingly successful. Reports emphasized coordination, discipline, and technological superiority, creating the impression of a flawless war machine. This early narrative encouraged civilians to believe that the conflict would be short and decisive. Optimism was not spontaneous, it was carefully cultivated to prevent doubt from taking root during the critical initial stages of war. As fighting expanded across multiple fronts, propaganda adapted to the growing complexity of the conflict. The war was framed not simply as a struggle for territory but as an existential battle for survival. Germany was portrayed as being surrounded by enemies who sought its destruction, culture, and future. This narrative transformed aggression into necessity, allowing offensive actions to be perceived as defensive responses. By redefining the meaning of war itself, propaganda justified continuous mobilization and obedience. Life on the home front became a central focus. With resources redirected toward the military, civilians faced shortages, rationing, and disruption of daily routines. Rather than acknowledging hardship as a consequence of policy decisions, propaganda reframed it as a badge of honor. Endurance was celebrated as patriotism, and discomfort was presented as proof of commitment. Citizens were encouraged to view personal sacrifice as a direct contribution to national strength, turning suffering into a moral obligation. Women were increasingly addressed as key participants in the wartime narrative. Messaging emphasized their responsibility to maintain households, support production, and raise children who embodied national values. Their labor was praised, but within strict ideological boundaries that reinforced traditional roles. Through idealized portrayals, propaganda balanced the need for female participation with the regime's vision of social order, ensuring that wartime necessity did not challenge long-term ideological goals. As casualties mounted, propaganda faced its greatest test. Death could not be hidden entirely, but it could be reframed. Fallen soldiers were honored as heroes whose sacrifices were portrayed as meaningful and necessary. Grief was transformed into pride, and mourning was encouraged to coexist with loyalty. By controlling the language of loss, propaganda prevented despair from evolving into resistance. The tone of messaging shifted as the war turned against Germany. Instead of promising quick victory, propaganda began to emphasize resilience and perseverance. Defeats were described as temporary setbacks or strategic withdrawals, often blamed on external factors such as overwhelming enemy numbers. Responsibility was deflected, and faith in leadership was preserved through selective storytelling. The aim was no longer enthusiasm, but endurance. Fear became a more prominent emotional tool during this phase. The consequences of defeat were described in extreme terms, suggesting chaos, revenge, and annihilation at the hands of enemies. This fear-based narrative discouraged surrender and reinforced the idea that continued resistance was the only path to survival. Even as conditions worsened, propaganda sought to close off psychological escape routes by making the alternative appear unbearable. At the same time, propaganda intensified its portrayal of enemies as morally corrupt and culturally inferior. This dehumanization served multiple purposes. It justified continued fighting, reduced sympathy for civilian suffering on opposing sides, and reinforced internal cohesion. By stripping enemies of individuality, propaganda simplified the moral landscape of war, making violence easier to accept. One of the most disturbing roles of wartime propaganda was its contribution to mass violence beyond the battlefield. As military operations expanded eastward, messaging increasingly linked war aims with racial ideology. Entire populations were depicted as obstacles to progress or threats to security. This language prepared both soldiers and civilians to accept extreme policies without questioning their ethical implications. Propaganda did not merely accompany violence, it normalized it. Despite its reach, propaganda could not fully control personal experience. Bombings, food shortages, and the absence of loved ones created gaps between official narratives and lived reality. These gaps grew wider as the war dragged on. Yet even in this environment, propaganda remained influential, not because it convinced everyone, but because it shaped the boundaries of acceptable thought. Doubt might exist privately, but public expression of dissent became increasingly rare. By the final years of the war, propaganda had taken on a defiant tone. Appeals were made not to hope, but to duty and destiny. Survival itself was framed as resistance. The regime sought to extract the last reserves of loyalty from a population exhausted by years of conflict. While belief in victory had faded for many, the psychological structures built by years of propaganda continued to influence behavior. In the end, wartime propaganda delayed collapse but could not prevent it. Reality asserted itself with undeniable force. Yet the damage had already been done. Through years of emotional conditioning, selective truth, and moral distortion, propaganda had reshaped how millions understood war, responsibility, and humanity. Chapter 3 of this story reveals how propaganda functions most dangerously, not when it inspires enthusiasm, but when it sustains destruction long after hope has vanished. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 did not simply mark the end of a military conflict, it exposed the long-term consequences of a society shaped and conditioned by systematic propaganda. As Allied forces entered German cities and concentration camps were liberated, the carefully constructed narrative that had dominated public life for more than a decade disintegrated almost overnight. Ordinary citizens were confronted with realities that had been hidden, distorted, or denied. This sudden exposure revealed the profound power propaganda had exercised over perception, morality, and collective responsibility. In the immediate aftermath of defeat, many Germans claimed ignorance of the regime's crimes. This response was not solely an attempt to escape blame but also a reflection of how effectively information had been controlled. Propaganda had not required universal belief to succeed, it only needed to limit awareness and discourage questioning. Over time, silence, selective reporting, and emotional conditioning created a population that adapted to partial knowledge. The result was a society where many people knew fragments of the truth but lacked the context or courage to assemble them into a clear moral judgment. The Allied occupation authorities quickly recognized that dismantling Nazi influence required more than political restructuring. Propaganda had shaped habits of thought, not just opinions. Newspapers, radio stations, and schools had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Educational reforms focused on critical thinking and historical accountability, aiming to reverse years of ideological conditioning. This process revealed how deeply propaganda had penetrated everyday life, influencing language, assumptions, and social norms. One of the most significant post-war developments was the legal recognition of propaganda as a form of crime. During the Nuremberg trials, Nazi leaders were not only prosecuted for military aggression and genocide but also for incitement and manipulation. The trials established an important precedent, that spreading hatred and deliberately deceiving populations could carry legal responsibility. This marked a turning point in international law, acknowledging that mass persuasion could be as destructive as physical force. The psychological impact of Nazi propaganda extended well beyond the war years. Survivors, perpetrators, and bystanders alike struggled to reconcile personal memories with newly revealed truths. Many experienced guilt, denial, or confusion, unsure where responsibility began and ended. This moral disorientation highlighted one of propaganda's most damaging effects, its ability to blur ethical boundaries. By normalizing exclusion and obedience, it had weakened individual moral judgment, making extraordinary crimes appear routine or unavoidable. Globally, the lessons of Nazi propaganda influenced how post-war societies approached media, governance, and freedom of expression. Democratic nations became more aware of the dangers of centralized information control and unchecked political messaging. The importance of independent journalism, pluralism, and open debate gained renewed emphasis. At the same time, governments recognized that propaganda was not exclusive to dictatorships, even democratic systems could misuse persuasion under certain conditions. The rise of modern mass media further amplified these concerns. Radio and film had played a central role during the war, but post-war technological advances expanded the reach and speed of communication. This raised urgent questions about responsibility, ethics, and regulation. The Nazi example served as a warning of how rapidly technology could be weaponized when combined with ideology and power. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Nazi propaganda lies in its relevance to the modern world. While the symbols and language have changed, the underlying techniques remain familiar. Simplification, repetition, emotional manipulation, fear-mongering, and scapegoating continue to appear in political communication across different societies. The history of World War II demonstrates that propaganda does not require universal agreement to function, it thrives in environments where complexity is replaced by certainty and criticism is framed as betrayal. Education has therefore become one of the most important defenses against propaganda. Post-war efforts emphasized historical awareness not as a matter of national shame, but as a safeguard against repetition. By studying how ordinary people were influenced, later generations are encouraged to recognize warning signs in their own time. The goal is not merely to remember the past, but to understand the mechanisms that made it possible. Nazi propaganda also challenges simplistic explanations of evil. It reveals that large-scale injustice does not always rely on fanaticism alone. Instead, it often depends on gradual adaptation, emotional fatigue, and the desire for belonging. Propaganda exploits these human tendencies, turning conformity into a virtue and doubt into a weakness. Recognizing this complexity does not excuse wrongdoing, but it deepens understanding of how societies can drift toward moral collapse. In reflecting on the end of the Nazi regime, it becomes clear that propaganda was not an accessory to power but one of its foundations. It shaped perception before shaping action, making extreme policies seem reasonable and violence appear necessary. By the time physical defeat arrived, psychological damage had already been done. Rebuilding required not only new institutions, but new ways of thinking. The story of Nazi propaganda ultimately serves as a reminder that truth is fragile when confronted with authority, fear, and repetition. Its legacy warns that the erosion of critical thought rarely happens suddenly, it unfolds gradually, often unnoticed. World War II demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of this process on a global scale. Remembering this history is not simply an academic exercise, it is an essential act of vigilance in any society that values human dignity, accountability, and freedom.